introduce Peter van Elswyk. He's an assistant professor in philosophy and affiliated faculty in cognitive science at Northwestern University. His research focuses on the philosophy of language and mind. It is interdisciplinary, bordering areas of metaphysics and epistemology, aiming to understand how conversation works. He has published many works related to honesty in journals such as Philosophical Studies, Philosophical Review, and Linguistics and Philosophy. For the Honesty Project, he's focused on honesty and its significance to the well-functioning of conversation. Please join me in welcoming Peter for his talk, Honesty and Social Cognition, from Animal Deception to Human Deception.
So this is newer work that kind of took what I originally wrote for the grant as a little bit of a point of departure. So at the end of the workshop last year, I didn't like the draft of the paper. I had ultimately settled on trying to analyze what honesty was, its behavioral and motivational components. And as soon as I got on the plane on the ride home, I just started a new draft for a paper. Kind of around the same time, too, I was kind of having a methodological shift in how I wanted to think about issues in communication, which is my primary area of research focus. In linguistics and philosophy, it's pretty common to take the kind of unit of analysis to just be a conversation or a conversational system. And you can think about that by having a scoreboard or a scorecard. And so you think about conversation as something that you make moves in that adjusts the scoreboard in conversation. And that's a useful way of approaching a lot of different linguistic phenomena, which is why linguists, I think, favor it for a variety of different things. But kind of around this time, I was thinking, I don't think that's where a lot of, at least the questions I'm interested in, that's the right way to approach it in that kind of, the conversation is the unit of analysis. And so I've been thinking about things more in a kind of bottom-up approach by thinking about what are the psychological processes and abilities that underwrite conversation and make it kind of possible in the first place. So I'm interested in how you kind of get up to the conversational system as opposed to kind of starting there and taking that for granted. And I think when you approach it that way, you start to be really interested in social cognition in particular. And it also becomes really rewarding and interesting to start thinking about the differences between human communication and animal communication. So there's some really cool work that's been going on this kind of subject matter in a really disciplinary spanning way that tends to involve philosophers, cognitive scientists, primatologists, developmental psychologists, all trying to think about kind of what's distinctive about human communication, how do you get to that distinctiveness in comparison to other critters that engage in communication. So as I was starting to think about communication more generally in this kind of way, it started to become natural to start thinking about deception in this kind of way, and then so similarly wanting to think about honesty as informed from this way of approaching questions about communication. So the task for today is to kind of arrive at an analysis of honesty by starting with an analysis of deception. And I'm interested in an analysis of deception, what I mean by general and basic. General enough that it's going to not just apply to us, but other types of creatures. And basic enough that, and this is something I'd like to, I think, do in future work, make a case for an ontogenetic and phylogenetically basic conception of deception to get an idea of maybe how it evolves in humans too. So that's kind of some of the stuff I'm interested in. So that's why I'm going to be talking about animal deception kind of in the beginning, and then trying to build human deception on top of that, and then end by thinking about honesty as a trait at the very end. I will say at the beginning that I think the unification challenge and Christian talks about, that's not something I'm worried about or think that needs to be addressed. So I am going to give a deception first kind of account of honesty. I think behavior like cheating and stealing is different. And I think you can think about those behaviors as different. The differences between those behaviors become stark too when you're starting to think about some of these questions in a species comparative way. Primates will definitely steal your snack. All the primates will steal your snacks. Whether they engage in what's called tactical deception, for example, is much more controversial and difficult to kind of observe, whereas the snack stealing, et cetera, or cheating in a reproductive sense, like happens all across the primates. So differences in these types of behavior, it's interesting to think about these behaviors in that kind of way. Though it's going to be deception first, another thing I've kind of soured on, I feel like in the last couple of years, maybe because of all the referee requests I get about papers relating to lying, is the project of trying to give an analysis of lying. And so I'm kind of less interested in that and kind of just more interested in linguistic deception or deception more generally as a category. So I share some of the sympathies for the over-focusing on lying. It's a kind of complaint that a few people have aired in their talks. I totally share that. And will want to give an account that can apply to lying, but other types of deception as well. So to talk a little bit about animal deception, I talked about fireflies if you came to my talk last year, but firefly deception is a nice example of deception to kind of start with. Fireflies just do not have the psychological equipment to engage in the type of lying and misleading that we think about when we're thinking about linguistic or communicative deception. But fireflies engage in what looks really like a clean case of deception with respect to sexual signaling. So where most critters are lying in nature, it has to do with sex and food. Maybe that's where we lie most of the time too. But in this particular case, there's a female firefly. She's learned how to mimic the firefly coloring or signals of a bunch of different other firefly species. She can't mate with those other species. She can eat those other species. So this is a mix of the food and the sex. So she'll lure the male in of the other species. He thinks he's going to reproduce, and she's going to get a snack, and a snack that comes with, as this quote notes, useful protective chemicals. So she gets a healthy snack out of this act of deception. And it looks like, as Skirms kind of ends his quotes here, was, I would say this qualifies as deception, kind of, wouldn't you? And so fireflies are nice because when we look at mammals and other primates, you may start to wonder about the kind of psychological mechanisms that are driving some of that, but this looks like it's a case of animal deception. Coloring and camouflage provide other types of examples that you can look at. Bugs that are the coloring of things that as if they were poisonous, but they're not, right? That kind of stuff. But a lot of the literature on animal deception, I think you can, when you strip away some of the nitty-gritty details, the core is that the idea is that deception is a kind of misinforming that happens non-accidentally. So it's not an accident that the female firefly is able to send these signals to get a healthy snack in return. That happens in some sense non-accidentally. It doesn't happen intentionally, obviously. It's not something she plans to do, but it is something she doesn't do by coincidence or accident. And she's sending a signal that's misinformation in order to get the snack in return. So this is kind of the core of what I'm going to start with as the kind of basic and general kind of definition of deception. And then the kind of question I'm interested in is, okay, this seems to be a general definition that's going to work for capturing deception like the firefly. And then my approach is going to think about what does misinformation look like for different critters, and then ultimately critters like us, and how can we think about non-accidentality? So the thought is that these features of deception can be realized in very different ways, but the kind of functional profile of deception is the same. It's misinforming, which can take a few different shapes, and it's non-accidental, which can also take a few different shapes. But that's kind of the core of how to think about deception. So when thinking about how to think about the misinforming bit, in most cases it's just false information, right? She's saying, I'm a suitable mate. She isn't. Or the non-poisonous bug says, colors itself or is colored such that it says, look, I'm not palatable, but it sure is if the bird's going to eat it. So there's a kind of, it's just sending a false information. But I think at least how I want to think about deception is that deception doesn't require false information. We sometimes use deceive or lie as a kind of success term, and maybe successfully doing so involves getting false information across. But I think when we consider someone who's maybe just totally mistaken on some sort of topic, it would be weird to say that like all of their attempts to deliberately give people the opposite information doesn't count as deception. That looks like it counts as deception to me. So if you're a flat earther, but you're also just like a pathological liar, and so you tell people that the Earth is indeed spherical. Like, yeah, you happen to be giving people the truth, but in terms of like the functional profile of your behavior is you're very much trying to give them non-accidental bad information. So this is where animal deception, I think, is going to come apart from human deception, so we need to think about differences in misinforming. For animal deception, I think it's easy to just say it's false. I don't think it's as straightforward in the case of human deception. There's some interesting experimental work by John Turry that suggests that people treat lying as requiring falsity to it. I think that tells us more about kind of our intuitions about lying as a predicate that we apply to things and less about the nature of deception. But it is worth noting that that's a kind of point of departure with certain ways of thinking about, at least lying, for example, as a kind of deception. The other thing that's just going to be different we're going to need for when we're thinking about human communication is usually the way we explain the non-accidentality for animal communication is it's some sort of evolved advantage that the thing has got, right? So the lady firefly that was able to send this signal, those were that's more advantageous to be a lady firefly that can't send those signal. So selection pressures, et cetera, have allowed those ones to have advantage, allowed those ones to survive better, right? The bugs that have the coloring that says, look, I am not delicious to eat, even though they are quite delicious to eat, are going to survive better than the ones that don't have the coloring, sending false information about their deliciousness to predators. So that's the normal way we explain it. It's the accidentality is etiological or evolved, and it applies to the signal type, right? It's kind of the same signal. I'm a suitable mate. I'm bad to eat, et cetera. Whereas the evolutionary explanation isn't going to obviously work for us. And the other thing that isn't going to obviously work for us is that it's not about the type of signal. It's about particular instances may count as truthful or not, as deceptive or not. So the same sentence in different contexts could be used to perform a lie. And so it's going to depend on the instance of that thing, the token as I'm calling it, as opposed to the general signal, such that any instance of that signal is going to be false, as it is in the case for the coloration stuff. It's got to be token relative. So we got to have a different way to think about what it is to misinform, and we've got to have a different way to think about where the non-accidentality kind of kicks in or comes in to explain the misinforming. So that's where I'm going to start talking about human deception. So here's a kind of first pass about thinking about misinforming, where this allows it to be unintentional or intended, accidental or not. But the basic idea is to perform an action such that an observer will typically infer something from the performance of that action. And the thing they've inferred is something that the agent does not believe. So this allows, again, you can accidentally misinform someone this way, or you can non-accidentally misinform someone, but it's some sort of behavior that tends to be behavior that prompts you to draw inferences, and it prompts you to draw inferences that I don't endorse. So the main thing here that I'm thinking about in terms of the nature of misinformation is misinformation, instead of being true, false, full stop, which is, I think works in the case of animal deception, it's kind of endorsed or not via the speaker. So it starts to be, or an agent kind of relative notion of what is it to misinform. Whether or not something counts as misinforming is going to be relative to the information of the agent in question. This is kind of the step you go if you accept that you can engage in deception with true information, right? You have to anchor it to something like the perspective of the agent. And talking about it in terms of behavior that will license certain inferences and observers is an attempt to start to think about it in a general way that's not just tied to lying. And I'll get to some examples in a minute. One way of thinking about it this way, misinforming as I'm characterizing it, kind of has the profile of what's sometimes called ostensive inferential communication, which is where I'm drawing your attention to something in order to get you to draw some sort of conclusion about it. And ostensive inferential communication, especially kind of once you get to primates, to infants, and to us, looks like a major means by which we exploit communication, right? So if I'm pointing at something because I want a snack, right, that's a kind of ostensive inferential. I'm pointing at the snack, trying to get you to draw an inference, namely, I want the snack. And that's the kind of process that's involved. I think something similar is going on in acts of information. There's some sort of observed behavior, right? That's the attention drawing in on something, and upon drawing in on something, an inference is arrived at in some particular kind of way. So primate gesture and pantomiming is ostensive inferential. A lot of infant early communication involves pointing gestures, pointing to make assertions, pointing to ask questions, pointing to make requests. All kind of ostensive inferential, and so I think it's helpful to think about misinforming as also kind of having this ostensive inferential kind of flavor to it. So to give kind of examples, lying is going to count as this, right? Because when you say it's raining and you don't believe it in a context, right? That's a kind of linguistic behavior. People are inclined typically to infer it's raining from you saying it's raining, right? So asserting or saying P, language facilitates a really streamlined way of exhibiting a type of behavior that entitles observers to draw types of inferences. That gets conventionalized, that is biologically supercharged in all sorts of ways, but I think at a high enough altitude we can characterize it as a kind of behavior this way. Another example is flopping, or taking a dive, as it's sometimes called in sports. This is salient to me because the NBA just recently changed some of their rules with respect to flopping. So flopping occurs when there's prohibited contact between players. Sometimes players will act as if the prohibited contact took place in order to get the referee to make a call. So that's beneficial. This seems like it's a kind of deception where you engage in a kind of behavior. You want an inference to be drawn, namely a prohibited contact occurred, and you don't believe that prohibited contact occurred. If you're not familiar with flopping, may I introduce you to Marcus Smart, the former Defensive Player of the Year, formerly of the Boston Celtics, who's kind of notorious for falling down really strategically. So here's Marcus flying in all sorts of directions. And part of what makes flopping interesting is sometimes it's just straight up deception, right? But sometimes it's like a foul does occur and they're trying to get the attention of the referee, so it's exaggerated, but still kind of something truthful did happen. So there's lots. I pitched an article to ESPN on like, hey, I could talk about deception and flopping, and then they ghosted me. They didn't want that. So, but what then is it to be non-accidental? I think a first pass, and I'm going to introduce a wrinkle in a moment, but this is where I think you can make a powerful argument for intention being important, because intention is the means by which most of what we do is not accidental. We form some sort of plan. We execute that plan with kind of a means and structure, and that engages our motor system so that we move our body in certain types of ways to accomplish certain types of goals. And it seems to be the main means by which we distinguish, for example, just happenings from actions, right? Is there's control exhibited over the happening. That control is top down in the sense that it kind of starts or is connected to a kind of plan. And when we recognize actions in other people, right, part of what we're recognizing them as being intentional or goal-directed. So when very young children are starting to recognize actions, part of what they're doing is attributing intentions and goals at the very least. Little slippery sometimes with some of this developmental and primatology stuff about what's identifying goal-directedness versus kind of intentions. I'll just keep doing the disjunction to kind of dodge that worry a little bit. But it seems like the goal-directedness or the intentionality, we're in recognizing that, right? That's part of recognizing it as non-accidental. It's being accomplished for some aim or goal. That's the explanation for why it's happening. So to kind of put the pieces together in terms of non-accidental misinforming, one way to think about what's going on is that you're intentionally performing an action where that action is one where you're aware that observers will typically draw some inference, and that's an inference which you don't believe yourself. So you're intentionally performing behavior that you know people are going to draw conclusions from, and you think that that conclusion's no good. But you're planning to do that behavior anyway. So if you say something, for example, maybe accidentally, you say, oh yeah, I had some of the cake. Kind of convey indirectly that you didn't have all of the cake. This is known as a scalar implicature. But we can imagine cases where you kind of say that, aren't really thinking or planning that to be deception, right? Maybe you did eat all the cake. And it doesn't look like you've engaged in deception. You've accidentally misinformed them that you didn't eat all of the cake. And if you get called on it, like, you'd be like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to communicate that, right? And that can be authentic, right? It looked like maybe you did deception or maybe you didn't, but obviously you can, leftovers are preciously guarded in my household. And if someone has like a quantity of some sort of leftover, maybe you like sneak a few fries. You don't want to eat all of them, but maybe you do on accident, which I've done. And did you eat my leftovers? I ate some of your leftovers, trying to maybe suggest somebody else was the culprit, right? That's deception because I'm knowing what kind of inference my partner's going to draw, and I don't endorse that inference. I don't believe that I just didn't eat all of them. I know full well that I did. So on this particular view, deception requires metacognition in that you must intend to make available, in the sense I'm talking about, propositions you don't believe, right? So it starts to be something that's a little bit more cognitively demanding. I'm forming a plan to make public to you a proposition that I don't endorse. I know full well I'm making that available to you, and I don't endorse or believe that proposition. And usually such kind of acts of deception are accompanied by a sophisticated form of mind reading, or in other words, I'm trying to track what your information is in order to come to conclusions about like kind of how best to deceive you. So in general, most of our utterances plausibly involve quite a bit of mind reading for utterance design. We could talk about this more in Q&A if you want to hear about it. Deception's no exception. It would be weird if it wasn't a kind of exception. So there's a lot of planning that goes into our utterance choice. We do the planning when it comes to deception too, though I don't think the functional profile of deception for humans requires that. It's worth noting too that you would want a metacognitive component to how you're thinking about deception, because there's these interesting results that theory of mind training or mind reading training improves children's ability to deceive. So there's this funny article that's just like, with theory of mind training, honest children start lying more. And it's basically like, as you start tracking how people's mental states work, including themselves, right, a metacognitive component to that, they just get better at the deception, which is what you'd expect if there's a metacognitive kind of skill or process underwriting engaging in deception. If you also think, and this literature is very complicated in various ways, but if you think that neurodiverse children, in particular children with autism, have some sort of differences in how mind reading is realized. Traditionally, this is talked about in terms of impairments. I'm pretty skeptical in terms of the impairment way of framing it, but I do think it's realized differently. There's some research that seems to suggest that they might be able to do an initial lie. They're worse at doing the kind of lies to cover up the initial lie. That's kind of also what you'd expect if there's this metacognitive mind reading based component to what's going on. So wrinkle obviously being, if we're thinking about pathological lying, that might not be the kind of thing that's always planned out through intention forming. And if we're thinking about self-deception, that might not either. I'm skeptical about some of this stuff when it comes to the self-deception in particular. I know people like to run self-deception as not having intentional, but I think it's a hard question to adjudicate because there's a question of whether or not we find it natural to attribute it to intention in those contexts versus like what's actually going on inside the head of the person. And so there's a lot of cases in the philosophical literature where it seems weird to attribute intention, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of quick, perhaps spontaneous intention forming that's going on. So I'll just note that in terms of the wrinkle, even if you think of these things as not intentional, they still look importantly non-accidental, right? When someone's engaging in self-deception, it's not a coincidence, right? It's because of, if you have a view like von Hippel and Trivers of self-deception, where you're basically lying to yourself deceiving yourself in order to deceive other people, you kind of have this consciously you believe the thing that you subconsciously disbelieve. So there's a kind of fragmentation about how you're approaching this question. That's still a kind of non-accidental psychological state that is the product or the cause of the kind of self-deception. So I think the account can accommodate that. It's just that the multiple realizability of what non-accidentality looks a few different ways for humans. To get to honesty, to kind of wind down, so you can define it negatively in terms of, I'm just going to use habitually as a stand-in term for the pathological self-deception stuff. You can define it negatively as just kind of, you're not out of habit, or you're not out of the plans you're forming, performing acts that make a disbelieved proposition kind of available to other people. If you want to define it positively, one way to do it is to kind of just drop the talk of misinformed, to talk about making propositions available that are ones that you do believe or endorse. But I think one of the things that's interesting is to think about various ways of ratcheting up the definition of honesty, kind of against the backdrop of some of the stuff we've been talking about. So one way to ratchet it up is to think about a kind of metacognitive monitoring where you're paying close attention to the things you believe and trying to not make anything available that could cause someone to draw a false conclusion, right? Obviously, it would be extremely demanding to be like, don't ever perform actions that might typically entitle people to draw false conclusions or conclusions you don't endorse. But we can imagine a kind of monitoring that might really be important, to be really careful and cautious. I at least find kind of, when I'm talking to my son, I'm like, he's 6, I'm like monitoring potential misunderstandings that might take place. And I do so like way more than in the context of talking to a normal adult. And I'm kind of calibrating towards what he might believe, what I might believe, and trying to make sure that he doesn't draw a mistaken inference about things. So that's a kind of ratcheting up we might do. Still further, we might try, so not just monitoring the stuff, but monitoring, kind of combining them, making sure that I endorse it and making sure that no one's going to draw mistaken conclusions from it. So we can kind of, I think, in starting to think about honesty as involving a kind of stable trait to not engage in this type of behavior, or to more positively, non-accidentally engage in kind of behavior to share information we endorse, it can be more or less stringent. And so there's a kind of question to ask about, like, where do you draw that line? Where do you not draw that line? The main thing I kind of want to say to end with is that I don't think it full stop requires this kind of making sure that you're always believing everything you're saying, nor does it always require monitoring every kind of conceivable inference that a person might typically draw from the behavior that you're engaging in. But it does seem that there are cases where plausibly this is required to cultivate honesty. So if we're thinking about how do you get to the end point of informing people, giving them good information non-accidentally, and avoiding the behavior of non-accidentally giving them bad information, it might require for you to get there, right, a lot of this kind of heavy cognitive lifting. Though full stop in every instance, I'm not sure that it does. I also think, going back to the kid example, plausibly there are contexts where this type of stuff you need to kind of be, as the speaker, more vigilant in order to present information in such a way that people aren't drawing false conclusions from it. So some of you might know this notion of epistemic vigilance from Sperber and Wilson. So they talk about how hearers come with a suite of abilities to kind of detect unreliability, deception in speakers, et cetera. But I think that there's a speaker side of this that can often be very situational, very relational. We're kind of depending on the individual. Like, I know my son's gonna, especially if there's an ambiguity in a word, he might draw the wrong type of conclusion. So I need to correct that. No, I don't mean, pen in this kind of way. I mean pen in this kind of way, or whatever the case may be, because I can kind of foresee that he's going to draw kind of false information otherwise. So I think there's this gets into murky issues about intention and foresight and all of that, which the ethicists in the room can help us with. But I think that there's a kind of full stop. It doesn't require the demanding stuff. But the really demanding stuff might be appropriate in certain contexts. And the really demanding stuff also might be really important when it comes to cultivating dishonesty or cultivating honesty, especially if your starting point is, you're not a very honest person to begin with. Maybe that that 3L, they get a little bit shadier on some stuff. Maybe they need a kind of like metacognitive training, like a 4L year to self-correct for that. But that's all I have to say for that. So thanks.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
So I actually have a question about the positive definition of honesty that you have.
Yeah.
Because this is something that, on the empirical side of things, we've talked a lot about, what's the difference between, just remaining silent versus, intentionally or habitually making a known proposition differentially available. A curiosity I have here is, does the information need to be consequential or relevant in some way? Because you can imagine somebody who's sort of just introverted or taciturn, right? Who doesn't talk a lot, right?
Yeah.
Versus somebody who just feels the need to tell you everything that's on their mind, everything they've seen. Oh, there's a sale on carrots at a market, in 3 states away, just so you know. And it's accurate, right?
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, the person who's habitually making true information available to others that is of no consequence, would you say that there's something more, that person is performing more honesty or being more honest?
No. So I think I want to say that's orthogonal. And a separate question about what does it take to be a cooperative conversational participant. So if you remember Matt's talk, or if you're at Matt's talk, he put Grice's cooperative principle up on the board. And Grice had this idea that you should make your contributions as they are required for the purpose or direction of the talk exchange. It's something like the way he puts it. But in other words, it depends on the point of the conversation, right? So the question under discussion is something like, where are the carrots in all and only those states 3 states away, right? Then that contribution is relevant. And so it's like they're being cooperative, right? If the question under discussion is something like, what are great places to dine in the Greensboro area, then obviously it's not going to be relevant. So the failure of relevance is a failure of being cooperative, which is just a kind of separate dimension of on which to evaluate someone. So I don't think there's a kind of, so the way I'd want to revise it to kind of make this clear would be in most contexts where they're being cooperative or whatever, right? So it's not just like a rate of saying what you believe or know, right? That's not going to make you more or less honest.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. And just wanted to ask to clarify the notion of non-accidental in the human context, because you seem to be saying that to be non-accidental for the humans needs to be intended, but then you suggested afterwards that there can be cases of non-intentional, non-accidental human deception.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also thinking insofar as, or in that dimension that the humans share with other animals, perhaps we might have that sort of biological, especially in the sexual sphere, deception, which is not intentional but is non-accidental. Just wondering if it might be helpful to clarify the term there, like saying distinctively human deception or something, because it seems to be confusing.
Yeah, so in that part of the talk, I'm kind of giving a consolation prize because I'm not yet willing to fully concede that it's not intentional in these types of cases. I feel like that's an empirical question that just needs to be evaluated by ways of trying to figure whether or not they're measuring whether or not there's an intention formation going on in these cases. And some of the literature on self-deception doesn't address that as cleanly or clearly as I would like. So part of it's just consolation prize if you think that these are non-intentional. They still don't look accidental. But in terms of there being a lot of continuity with with the animal kingdom, I think that's fine. I think that's maybe even desirable to think that there might be instances of human deception that are in their functional profile, like extremely similar to cases of animal deception. And that wouldn't be, I think, a problem for the view. So I'm not in some sense I'm not interested in kind of like what I don't think all human deception is distinctively human. I think the intention stuff starts to bring that in view. But there might be instances of human deception which is just a kind of instance of a broader type of mammal deception or something like that. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much. This was fantastic. So I'm thinking about honesty with oneself and how this approach figures in that. Because it seems, so I guess what are your view on how conscious the metacognitive processing is, sort of generally? So sometimes it seems that this kind of just happens, right? I don't consciously think I'm going to be misunderstood in this way, etc. Even with interpersonal contexts. But it's going to be, I suppose, with self-deception, it's going to be an interesting case of whether kind of this, I'm not formulating the question well, but I'm deceived by something, so say I say I don't love her, but I do love her. Other people can see this, there's things going on. It seems, well, I'm not making the question, but I'm just interested if you have any thoughts about how this works out on a subconscious level and with self-deception. What kind of metacognitive awareness is present there?
Yeah, I mean, the self-deception stuff is where I kind of like have the biggest question marks myself a little bit. The Trivers picture where there's a kind of fragmentation between the conscious and the subconscious is a kind of main contender. I don't really like the view. I'm skeptical about some of the ways that he and co-authors draw the conscious-subconscious distinctions. A lot of our metacognition and mind reading is conscious, so to speak. It's a spontaneous kind of process. So it's not necessarily luminous or transparent to us in a straightforward kind of way, that every moment it happens, we're like acutely aware, vividly of it happening. That doesn't mean, though, that we're not in a position to do that, right? So sometimes that's talked about as recursive or higher order metacognition, where I'm reflecting, I'm forming beliefs about what my beliefs are, but what my beliefs are, that kind of a thing. Though fun research that 5 orders of both mind reading and metacognition seem to be, that's the typical human ceiling. Past 5, it's kind of like, maybe you can hit 7 with training. I'm inclined to think that most of it's taking place in a conscious kind of way. Getting into the literature on consciousness is tricky, but I like kind of workspace theories, so I think it's all happening in the kind of global workspace. And so that's part of also my skepticism of some of the Trivers stuff is wouldn't happen in the workspace, at least on some ways of reading it. So yeah, I think I'm answering your question with just like another question. I don't know exactly how to think about the self-deception stuff. It does seem interesting, though, that self-deception partly becomes possible because misinforming is not just this matter of sending a false signal. It's this kind of perspectival thing that's going on. And so we can start to kind of mess with ourselves, not just mess with other people to get healthy snacks or whatever. And so it does seem acutely caught up in the social cognition aspect of it that supercharges our ability to misinform in non-accidental ways. I don't have a clear idea, though, about how all those details shake out.
Me?
Delia.
No, I'll pass to Candace. Okay, we were talking aside because we're both developmental psychologists, so we are thinking a lot about kids.
Yeah.
So kids can behave in deceptive type ways before they have the metacognitive skills to understand what they're doing. So in some ways, similar to the insects and animals, but it's still a continuum from there where animals can only reach a certain point of deception. Kids can go, they can be crazy with it.
Right.
And so I'm also thinking about, you mentioned the epistemic vigilance. our ability to detect deception, our ability to deceive others, our awareness of the information, the quality of information that we're getting. There are signs that kids can evaluate the quality of information before they recognize that they're doing so. Like they'll reject, somebody calls, if I call this a banana, they can be like, no, but even if they're like 2, they will still be doing stuff like that. So I'm trying to figure out, there's this transition as kids are capable of more metacognitive skills. Is there just this checkpoint where, okay, they're metacognitive enough that it's deceptive, and before that point, it's deceptive behavior, but not deception with intention? Like,
Sure.
how do you fit in the development into your framework?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to the detecting deception stuff, I do want to just say that as theory of mind stuff comes online, there's a change, and that change is relevant to that, right? So you're thinking of some of the Harris studies with the banana, and shoe stuff, and you, and yeah, I mean, it does seem like they're tracking like reliable, unreliable informants. That doesn't seem to involve lots of taxing kind of mind reading, but at least how I want to think about some of this literature. I like this proposal that factive or reality congruent or knowledge mind reading comes online before belief mind reading. And so I think part of what happens is deception detection gets better because we're able to say like, or you're ignorant. But then I can't really do the belief, I can't do true belief or false belief easily. But then once I can kind of do both, right? So that round 4 when they can start passing the false belief tasks, I do think we see that tends to correlate with some of this ability to detect deception better. So I'm inclined to say something like that, though I'd be curious for your perspective on that. In terms of like the engaging in deception stuff, I don't have a firm opinion on this yet. Some people want to read into it to be like, see, look, as evidence for early kind of mind reading. Like they're doing the deception stuff. They're saying no spontaneously. They're rejecting the shoe qua banana. I'm not sure about that. I like your interpretation of it, which seems like it's a kind of non-accidental deception that doesn't yet have the planning going on, but I'm not quite sure how to think about that non-accidentality yet. So it would be super here after we could talk more about it. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for the talk, Dave. That was really interesting. So I guess I'm interested in how your views interact with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious to hear your reaction to floating a package of views and hear what you think. So suppose I'm like I'm like an epistemically humble person, and so I've got I'm confident to like 50% in lots of propositions. And suppose I've got this picture where there's credences, and then you believe outright when you have a sufficiently high credence in some proposition. And suppose I'm especially forthright, like I go around intentionally making my credences known to people in a sort of non-accidental way that you specified. Am I going to count as deceiving all the time and then hence dishonest?
Because your communication is always accompanied with like a creedal assignment?
Yeah, I'm just telling I'm this confident in P and Q and whatever. But that confidence never really rises to the level of outright belief because I'm, again, humble. And I've got this view about credence and belief.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll count if you're not always kind of giving your marker of, if you're not marking your uncertainty, I think it will count as deception. And this connects this kind of stuff that Matt was talking about because I think it'll implicate that it'll represent yourself as knowing it in some cases, right? So if you just say P without kind of qualifying your uncertainty, then yeah, it's gonna suggest that you believe or know P. And I think that will count as deception. If you're always going around marking your uncertainty about it, I don't think that counts as deception because there's no indirect thing that's going to be false or misleading, right? So you're not going to be misrepresenting yourself in some sense. So this is where, if you're hedging, right, then I think you're good to go in terms of this view. And I do think it's interesting, though, that like we don't, unless you're like Nate Silver or something, you're not hedging by talking about your priors and your credence assignments, right? We're using more folk psychological attitudes like belief, think, guess when we're engaging in these types of markers of uncertainty.
Cool. Thanks.
I just want to follow up on the child case and your question as well. I mean, it seems to me you're using some kind of notion of intention, like Rathman's planning theory. But that's like prior intention. There's all sorts of intentions in action that have no prior planning, but they still count as intentional. So, and that would help you to include the pathological case as a kind of reliable skill. So why not just think of intentionality less stringently?
Yeah, super open to that. I mean, I do think to kind of fit with what we know from some of the psych stuff, it does seem like it can be very spontaneous and not in this really elaborate Bratmanian kind of way. So yeah, I want to think about it that way. I think I have a tendency, because it's what I've read the most of, to talk more Bratmanian than my commitments are. So yeah, point totally well received.
Okay, let's do one more, so I'm not keeping you from lunch.
So you gave kind of an account of the motivations that underlie honest communication. And honesty is a virtue, as we all know. So you're giving a kind of account of the modes that underlie kind of virtuous behavior. And I'm wondering how that account sits alongside other accounts of other virtuous kinds of behavior. I'm particularly attracted to like a Nomi Arpali, Aristotle-ish account of, let's say, acting with moral worth, where you just respond to the relevant considerations. You don't even need to think of those considerations as being morally important as such. You're just like moved by human suffering to help. And you don't even need to think about the moral significance as such of human suffering. So it's like a very cognitively undemanding account of virtue. You just have to be moved by the right considerations to do the right behavior in the right way, which isn't terribly cognitively demanding. And that, but you've given a very cognitively demanding account of honesty. So I'm just wondering how, like, do you think, does the cognitive demandingness carry over to other accounts of virtue? Like, just how does that still work?
Yeah, I think what I would want to say is the virtues are going to need to manifest in the actions, and though virtue manifestation might be just being kind of moved in a certain kind of way, what it looks like to be moved in a certain way is going to kind of be parasitic on how complex the action is, right? So it might be that like responding to suffering or being courageous is not metacognitively demanding because acts of courage or assistance or whatever themselves are not that perhaps require these levels of metacognition, et cetera. But I think there's good reason to think of communication as something that kind of builds up from this ostensive inferential communicative processes that involves a lot of planning and utterance design and tracking what our addressee knows and doesn't know. And so because that activity is going to be one that's metacognitively demanding in various ways, then responding in the right kind of way in that type of action is going to require certain types of metacognitive demand. So that's how I'm going to want to think about it it doesn't tell us anything about virtuous action full stop. It kind of tells us about virtuous action in this sphere or domain where there tends to be more metacognitive demands.
Thank you, Peter.